been suggested that I should give a brief overview of what the organ is. This is the organ console, and this is what everyone thinks is the organ. However, this is just part of it. Moving up, at the front of the church, rises the organ case. At the top of the organ case is the organ chamber. At the front are coloured bronze pipes. These front pipes are the loudest sounding pipes from a family of pipes or ranks of pipes called the diapasons. The diapasons is what most people would think of an organ sound, and these sound something like this. At Bellshill Central, we have got two diapasons. That was the quieter one, and this is the louder one. Organs are split into families of sounds. And that sometimes means that things are split over many keyboards and a pedal division. The top keyboard in Bellshill Central is called the swell organ, and it's called that because you can swell the sound. It's located looking at the organ on the left-hand side within a box, a big box, and on the front of it there are, looks like vertical blinds, louvered doors, and as you open the doors the sound gets louder, and as you close the door the sound gets quieter. So one of the quietest stops on the swell organ is our stopped flute. And as I open the swell box, you should hopefully hear it getting louder. And that is from the flute family. Organs imitate other instruments other than the diapason sounds, which is purely organ. So that was a flute sound from part of the swell organ. There is also some string sounds on the organ. The viola di orchestra, fancy sounding name for a string sound. And again, I can make that louder by opening the swell box. That stop comes with its neighbour, a pair, called the voix céleste. The two of them together gives an undulating effect, a moving effect. We get that undulating effect by this stop, the viola di orchestra, being tuned normally, and the voix céleste being slightly out of tune. So listen to one, and then we add the other. So the two together creates a nice shimmering, undulating string sound. Still with the swell, we have one of those organ sounds, a diapason, but almost string-like and called a violin diapason. slightly quieter than the loud ones we played earlier. Organs are built on a pitch principle. The 4 stops that we've heard on the swell are called 8-foot stops. That's just normal pitch. We then move up to what's called a 4-foot pitch. And that's kind of like an octave higher than the pitches and stops that we've heard before. Bellshill Central has a 4-foot Gems horn, which is almost like a small diapason. But if you quieten it down, closing the swell box, it sounds quite quiet and maybe like a little flute. Now that one's quite handy on this organ because it adds a bit of brightness. And that's us up to there. The last 2 stops on the swell organ of Bellshill is 2 reed stops, an oboe and a horn. These are both imitative stops, and the oboe, you could say, sounds like an oboe that you would find in an orchestra. And this one is at 8-foot pitch, which is just normal standard sound. And that can be toned down by closing the box. And then we have the horn, which is rather brash sounding, but it gives the organ that trumpet sound. All the stops can be played by themselves or together. So you can build up a nice chorus sound. Now some people might say that's quite loud, but that's not really loud for this organ. Quieter sound, using this flute and our string stops, might sound like this. Now on the swell organ, there's 3 stops that we've not yet pulled, but they don't sound. They do other mechanical things. The organ operates on a pitch level, 8 foot, like this, 4 foot, like this, but with stops like these, swell octave and swell suboctave, it releases a whole other variety of colours and sounds. So an 8 foot stop would sound like that, and played up an octave it would sound like that. However, using the coupler system, swell octave, I can play both notes at the one time. And going the opposite way, if I do the swell sub-octave, I can play 3 notes at the one time, but just by pressing one of the keys. On its own, swell octave, sub. That means when you're playing, you've got a greater variety of sound. Here's how that sounds with the horn. On its own. On its own with the octave above. On its own with the octave below. All 3 together. So if we pull out all the stops, pardon the pun, with the octave above and the octave below, it sounds really very loud. And that's only half of the organ. So in our next episode, I'll introduce you to more. Hello and welcome to episode 6, I think this will be. Following on from episode 5, where we started introducing you to some of the stops of the organ, we now go to the great organ. The great organ, as its name suggests, is great. It's the loudest sounding part of the organ on its own. As you look at our organ, it is located on the right-hand side, and all of the pipes across the front, the display pipes. And as we've already looked at, the display pipes are part of our open diapason family of pipes, the right true organ sound. And we've got 2 open diapasons, as we found out in episode 5, I think. So that was the large open diapason, and this is the smaller open diapason. Now we are quite lucky to have 2 of them. That one on its own, our small open diapason, is probably as loud as some organs' only open diapason. But we've got 2, which allows for a little bit of flexibility. Staying with the diapason family, the organ sound, we move up an octave, a pitch, to give us the principal sound. So that's like your open diapason, but up the octave. What you normally do is play these 2 families or ranks of pipes together. And with the large open diapason, we have our diapason family altogether. On the grate, all of the pipes are open within the space of the room, the organ chamber, so there's no way to make them louder or quieter. That's one of the reasons why all of the stops have got a slightly different volume with them, so you can vary the sounds without the use of the swell box and the swell shutters. Also on the great organ, we have some quieter stops. Imitative stops again, but different to the imitative stops that we've got on our swell organ. The quietest stop, 8-foot pitch, so we're at normal pitch, is called a dulciana. That's got a slight string-like quality to it, but it's also like a very, 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 very quiet diapason. So it could be part of that family as well. The dulciana stop is more of an accompanying stop for perhaps the oboe on the swell. So that might sound something like this. Quite nice. The other two stops on the grate that we haven't looked at yet are flute sounding stops. An 8-foot flute, difficult to say, so we'll try that again. 8-foot flute, called a clarabella. It's a different sound to the swell flute. It's more open and round and warm. And it's got a 4-foot flute, harmonic flute. So it's different kind of sound timbre to it. And that one's almost like a real sounding flute. Both flutes together. Flutes together. Quite nice. There's one more stop available on the great organ, and that's a 16-foot stop. So that means its longest pipe is 16 foot, for the rest of the pipes, other than the principal, their longest of pipes has been 8 foot. So the bourdon, longest pipe is 16 foot, and that's a really low sounding pipe used to give body and a bit of a foundation to it. Not used all the time, but useful. And it shares some of its pipes with the pedal organ. And that was just simply a space-saving and a money-saving idea that some organ builders had. It's a flute, but a lower flute. So if we play it up the octave, we compare that with the proper 8-foot. Sounding stops, but play it at its pitch, it sounds a bit too muddy to use as a solo stop. It can be useful sometimes, and it is a lovely sounding stop. Played all together, and I'm not going to use the Dulciana because you can't hear it, so that's just a waste of air. With the 16 foot. Now, you may wonder how someone selects or chooses the stops to play. That's an art all in itself, so we'll save that for another time. However, this organ of its time, 1930s, doesn't have any 2-foot stops, ranks of pipes. So that the further up you go, the smaller the longest pipe gets. However, we can create a 2-foot flute using our 4-foot flute, but playing everything up the octave. And if we had one of those on its own, it might be called a piccolo, perhaps. And before we leave the great organ, there's a nice combination. Our 4-foot flute, kidding on, it's a 2-foot flute, and our 16-foot bourdon, which is kind of like a flute, played up the octave, so you get a nice combination of 2-foot and 8-foot. Like the swell organ, there's some extra stops at the top. They don't make their own sounds, other than clanking about. They link the other side of the organ, the swell organ, together, because you need 4 hands to play it like that normally. So the coupler system allows us to play it all together. Our diapason family. And let's see if we can hear the diapason family from the other side and top. But this stop here creates an octave above, and that gives a nice, bright, brilliant sound. And the more stops we add from the other side, the more that you can hear. Add one of our reed stops, the oboe. And add the final one, the horn. And then if we add the big open diapason and the swell to great, borrowing it down, sub-octave, we get more or less the full sound. Finally, one other trick that us organists use in playing things at octaves which they really shouldn't be played at, if we use the swell sub-octave, which is playing everything down an octave, and we use the 16-foot bourdon, you can sometimes, for that extra final flourish or that really extra loud piece that you're wanting to play everything up an octave. that's us covered more or less all of the organ at Bellshill Central. And on our next episode, we'll look at the pedals. Our last investigation into the three main organ divisions of the church organ takes us to the pedal division. Now, the pedal division contains some of the lowest sounding pipes on the organ, and it's controlled by the pedal board, which is laid out the same as the keyboards above it. C, C sharp, D, D sharp or E flat, E, F, etc. Now, there aren't as many keys, pedals to play, and that's generally because everything that you play with your feet for the musical ones among us is usually below middle C. And middle C is at the top part of the pedal board, this section here. And that would be known as middle C on the keyboards above, which is round about there. Bellshill Central has a small pedal division, but nonetheless fairly pungent when it has to be. There are 3 stops, ranks of pipes on the pedal organ. There's a bass flute, which is at 8-foot pitch, meaning that the longest of its pipes is 8 foot. So that means it would sound at the same pitch as the Clarabella flute, which you can see just on the right on the great stop jab. Below the bass flute, we have a bourdon at 16 foot. This stop shares a number of its pipes with the great bourdon. So you could say that the pedal section pipes is an extension down the way of the great bourdon 16 foot. And that does give quite a good deep foundation tone to the organ, as we'll hear shortly. The final stop on our organ, this one here we're zoomed in on, it's called an open wood at 16 foot. Now, these pipes in the organ, which we can't unfortunately see because they are at the right back of the organ chamber, they're square wooden pipes, hence the name open wood. However, before the organ was refurbished a few years ago, this particular stop was named an open diapason. And while diapasons can be wooden pipes, the naming of it as an open wood is much more appropriate. This particular stop, the open wood at 16-foot pitch, which is the fattest and longest of all the pedal pipes, gives a really good foundation and rumble, and at times it could be said that it really does make the floorboards rattle. Apologies for the knees, folks. It's been quite a sunny day, so the organist has been enjoying the air. However, this is the pedal division, and not many people get to see what goes on down here. Now, what I'm going to do just now is just show you that the organ pedal board works in a similar fashion to its keyboards, its manuals. So, apologies for the trainers, however, which I could play up here. However, let's get back to how these particular organ stops sound on the pedal boards. The first of our three stops on the pedal organ is a bass flute, which sounds like this. The second stop on the pedal organ is the 16-foot bourdon, which shares some of its pipes with that stop there. And it sounds a bit like this. The last stop on the pedal organ is the open wood, the big beefy sounding one. And I'll just play that same phrase of notes. So hopefully you were able to hear from up here somewhere the different tones of each sounding pipes. Oops. I'll just hold a note and I'll let you hear each of the three on the same note. That's your 8-foot bass flute, your 16-foot bourdon, and your 16-foot open wood. You might even hear a rattle there, but that's fine. In one of our previous episodes, I spoke briefly about the coupler system, whereby the swell organ can be played on the great organ altogether. Otherwise, you'd have to be a bit like an octopus with at least 4 hands. The same principle applies to the pedal division. You can borrow down some of the swell sounds to the pedal, and similarly you can borrow down some of the great sounds to the pedal. And that is particularly useful here in Bellshill when we only have 3 pedal stops, so you do need to rely on borrowing things down. Now here's the horn, played where it should be played. And if we use one of the couplers, swell to pedal, and I will go over here and just show you that we have no pedal stops on, but we can hear the horn. Sorry folks, I really should have taken the trainers off. And that principle works for the great organ. So if I draw great to pedal, and just again confirm, these are all off, and what will we choose? Since we've had the 8-foots, we'll go for the 8-foot diapason. And we'll have that same phrase again. Which, if we played it on the great organ at the pitch that I was playing it at with my feet, it just sounds the same. I've had to put the camera back up in the stand because I can't do this next bit while holding the camera. What I've chosen to play is just a small piece of a Bach prelude, and it's written in music fashion with a treble stave and a bass stave, which is lines of music, treble clef and bass clef, but it's got an additional line for bass clef, and that's for the feet to play. And on particularly Baroque music, which is what Bach is classed as being, a Baroque composer, your hands, right and left, and your feet can quite a lot of the times do something different. And on this prelude, we have a pedal section which then flows into hands together and completing the first part of it. This is a loud section, so I've drawn a lot of the stops and I have drawn the couplers to give it that extra height with the octaves above it. And hopefully you can see my feet. Pedals generally accompany most things, hymns and other chorale, slower items of music. As the Bach displayed, they can play little solo things themselves. Noel Rothstorn composed a piece of music using familiar pieces of music from many, many years ago. And sometimes the pedals allow you to get a real good range of sound quickly without having to change any stops. So take my word for it, I've prepared our swell organ, all of it out, and I've coupled that down to the pedals. I haven't coupled the swell to the grate, because that's not the sound I'm wanting. And I've got the grate organ prepared with the 4-foot flute, and I'm going to play that like a small piccolo. And you'll see what I'm going to do. So we had the pipes sounding like a boat coming up the Clyde. The next section sounds a little bit similar. It's the same tune, the sailor's hornpipe, but we've got an additional stop out, so we've got that combination that I mentioned before of 2-foot and 8-foot, and the pedals come in with what sounds like a wrong note, but it's not, trust me. It's a fun piece of music, utilising the pedals so that you don't have to change many stops, but you are playing with your 2 hands and your feet. French composer Charles-Marie Widor is synonymous with his toccata from his 5th Symphony. Now, lots of people ignore the pedal part. They are always interested in this bit. That's the bit everybody knows. However, the full first page of this particular score of it has got no pedal. Moving through it, we go through the different phases of it, but the part that I'm after is at the very, very end of it. The pedals have the tune. Now, I'll tone down the swell a little bit so that you can hear. And I won't do the fancy bits so that you can concentrate on what my feet are doing, hopefully. And that is the tune. some people like that particular piece of music played fairly quickly, which means that the fingers go like the clappers. However, once we get to this particular part of the piece, it's the pedals that's the star of the show, and it really should be played a little bit slower so that you can hear this big, beefy, dropping series of notes. Finishing this introduction overview of the pedal section of the organ, there's one piece of music which has been included in a previous Organist Entertains, and it's the toccata from Bach, his D minor toccata. Lots of fancy finger work going on, but at the end of it, maestoso, slow, mysterious and grand, that section which is this bit. The pedals have got a little showy bit. So let's hear that. Concludes our tour, introduction to an overview of the three main constituent parts of the organ here at Bellshill Central with the pedal division. Now, finishing off today's episode as a little tour of some of the accessories, which is what they're called, that this organ has. Now, some people have been asking, what do these buttons do here? And there are some similar bronzy brass toe studs. They're just buttons, but you kick it with your foot down here in the pedals. They're called your combinations. Now, I once was told a joke about, have you ever seen an organist changing their combinations during the middle of a service? Now, I didn't have a clue what they were talking about, but they thought it highly hilarious. Now, I've now found out what another meaning of the word combinations might be, and I can certainly assure you that this organist does not change those type of combinations during any sort of service. However, he might start to change these combinations. Now, the divisional pistons, they're like presets that I can set up for particular sounds. So hopefully you can see the stops to the left. If I select one of these buttons, pistons, you should hopefully see things changing. And then, because this organ was refurbished a couple of years ago, we've got a little bit of electronic gizmo wizardry put in it. So instead of just having 3, I've got another 3 by going between levels 1 and levels 2. So if you watch over to the left again, hopefully you'll see them changing. 2, they 2, and they 2. Now, the whole point of having a piston system like this is to make things a little bit easier for the organist when they're pulling stops and they're playing. Before a hymn begins, usually all the stops will be off, not drawn. And it's quite easy to pick out some stops when you're not playing. But when the hands are busy, you can get a little bit cross-eyed, trying to figure out what stops to pull, and then you got all caught up with your hands getting caught and your fingers getting caught. So these divisional pistons, because there's some for the swell keyboard, just listen to see how this has been set up to get louder. So that's number one. Number two is a bit louder. And number three is louder again. And the same works for the grate and the pedals. So, no stops drawn, but I'll go for piston one. That pulls out 3 stops. That adds some more. That adds more again. So I hope you can hear me shouting over the organ. Now that becomes particularly useful when you're wanting to change the sound, the tone, or the dynamic quite quickly. So what I'm going to do for you is play, which is probably one of the UK's most favourite of hymns, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, to the tune of Repton, and that is a very familiar, famous tune by Parish, and it's familiar words, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, forgive our foolish ways. The verses need totally different sounds and moods created, and the last verse has a call for a dramatic losing of stops, which is easy to do if you're not really using your hands, but then you wouldn't be playing the organ. So this is where the combinations and the piston settings come in really handy. So you'll see me pull some stops now and again, but you'll also see me use the pistons, and you'll hear the changes to the tones, the colour and the dynamics as we go. So this is Repton for Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. And that's how you can use the combination pistons for each division, swell and grate with pedals, by using these pistons here underneath each keyboard, or the toe studs, which just replicate what's going on up here with your toes as you play with your hands and your feet, which means changing all these stops could get a little bit difficult. So hopefully that's interesting to people. It lets you get another little bit of insight as to what goes on down here in the organ pit, and it let you hear another lovely hymn tune. So tune in next time for The Organist Entertains, which will be on Wednesday. Good night. I thought I'd come a little bit closer to you for our little continuing tour of the organ and the sounds that it produces, and how perhaps the thought process that I have comes into being for particular pieces of music. Now, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see what I have in front of me. It is a page from Stainer's Crucifixion. The church choir, with some friends, year before last, presented excerpts from Stainer's Crucifixion to a congregation here in the church during Holy Week. Stainer's Crucifixion is known as an oratorio, and it's basically some scripture set to music. Written by John Stainer, which is where we find the name Stainer's Crucifixion, contains solos, choir items and hymns. Something we've cheated and used as a little anthem at church is Cross of Jesus, one of the more familiar items of music from the Crucifixion. The words are most haunting, very descriptive, requiring the singers to sing with passion, sing with feeling, to get the mood across to those listening. That also means the organ itself has got to paint a picture. And that is what we do Sunday by Sunday with hymns. But things like this, we have to do it even more so, thinking more closely with the words, painting with the sounds that's available to the organ. The penultimate verse we sang with just the men and a concoction of singers that Holy Week a few years ago. The words are, "From the holy, 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 we adore thee, O Most High." This bit requires some delicate painting. Down to earth's blaspheming voices and the shout of, "Crucify!" The colours and tones of the organ really suit that verse quite lovely, with some grumbly, rumbling reeds and the lowest of the pedals rumbling and grumbling away, because you can't really shout "crucify" in a happy way. You've got to shout it almost in a blood-curdling way, because we are, in this particular hymn, the crowd shouting to crucify Jesus. Crucify! Crucify! Enjoy Cross of Jesus from Stainer's Crucifixion. Sticking with Stainer's Crucifixion, us organists have got a favourite movement in it. Well, for me, my favourite movement is Fling Wide the Gates. It's the third movement, and I think the best. It begins with what is called the processional to Calvary. And you can just imagine that slow walk to Calvary. The music then changes to a lighter, melodic movement within the opening section with a solo. And if I remember rightly, I used the oboe for it. And that is mimicking a part of the solo from within the choir element of that movement. After that's done, it goes back to the processional part, where you can quite visibly see in your head people progressing, processing, walking up the hill to Calvary, that slow but sombre walk. I'll let you hear some of it with the little oboe part, and perhaps you might see why, for us organists, that this is one of the favourite parts of the entire piece.